Hello, welcome back. I'm Jeniffer Thompson.
And I'm Chad Thompson.
And this is season 7
of The Premise.
Where we get to the story behind the storyteller. We've got some amazing authors lined up for you this season. And guess what? The San Diego Writers Festival is coming up in just a couple months, folks. It's March 28th at the Coronado Public Library. It's free to everyone. And this year's keynote is Jodi Picoult. So make sure and mark your calendars. We'll see you there. And for The Premise, we've just got an amazing lineup of people who are going to talk about storytelling and writing and publishing and just,
And cars.
And cars and pasta. So stay tuned. And be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Italian cars. Italian pasta.
Hello and welcome to The Premise. I'm Jeniffer Thompson.
And I'm Chad Thompson.
And we are here today with Bridget Crocker. And I am so excited about this conversation. I met Bridget in New York at Zibby Owens, actually. Your book was chosen, The River's Daughter, was chosen as one of her summer reads. And I can see why. What a great book. I loved it. I'm so glad you wrote it. Thank you.
Thank you for the great introduction, and thanks for reading and for having me on your podcast today. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, listeners, I really hope you buy this book. And in fact, I've told a couple book clubs about it, and I think I've already talked to one person who said we are doing it for our book club. And one of my questions for you is, do you show up at book clubs via Zoom or?
Yeah, I can show up if you're, within driving distance. I'll come to you.
You'll come in person. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I just got asked by my second book club in Malibu, just asked me to come and have dinner and talk. And
I want to join that book club.
Yeah, it's fun to sit with readers and people have a lot of questions.
I'm sure. Yeah, this is such a personal, it's a memoir, so of course it's personal, but it's like so beautifully written, and you bring us into these moments that are often hilarious, often heartbreaking, but really like water, it flows so beautifully through the experience of your life. And for me, it's really a book about finding yourself, finding your power, finding where you belong, and really owning it. And I really hope our listeners get a copy and enjoy it as much as I did. But I've gotten ahead of myself. Let's introduce Bridget to our listeners. So who is Bridget Crocker? She is a trailblazer in women's empowerment within the outdoor industry, a leading whitewater rafting guide in far-flung regions of Zambia, Ethiopia, the Philippines, Peru, Chile, Costa Rica, India, and the Western United States. She's also a contributing author to Lonely Planet guidebooks and travel anthology and the Best Women's Travel Writing series from Traveler's Tales. Her work has been featured in magazines including Westways, Men's Journal, National Geographic Adventure, Trail Runner, Paddler, Outside, Vela, and Patagonia's blog, which I read and love, The Cleanest Line, among others. And she lives in Malibu, California. So officially, Bridget, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, let's talk with your mom and your initial experience with water, in particular the Snake River, and how, she told you that the river would kill you, really warned you to stay away from the water. And in fact, the river actually saves your life. Literally and metaphorically, that's what this book is about. But can you take us to that moment when you fall in the water and what happens then?
Yeah. So as all good mothers do, my mother always warned me to stay away from the river. Don't, if you fall in the river, you're going to die. That was a refrain I heard all the time. And she said that because we lived outside of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, on the banks of the Snake River in a trailer park. And I had a fairly troubled upbringing, beginning with my parents' very volatile divorce when I was 4 years old. It was an incredibly violent relationship. My earliest memories are of domestic violence. There's a lot of trigger warnings on my book, and most of the things that are warned about are in the first act. So once we get to the whitewater, it starts to be pretty adventurous and kind of a high adventure rollicking story. But in the beginning, there's some things to overcome. So we moved to Wyoming with my stepdad, who I loved and who was a wonderful man and who had raised me since I was 4. And they had a son, so I had a new baby brother. And it was still, we lived in the resort economy of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and my parents were both in the service industry. And so it was tough making a living and raising a family there. And so I spent a lot of time by the river. It was a place where I could go to just sort of be myself and kind of lay down my burdens of being a kid, kind of growing up on the edge in so many ways. And, my mom would always tell me, like, when you're down there, don't go near the river, because if you fall in the river, you will die. But it was my favorite thing to do, go and... I was
going to say, but you were drawn to it, weren't you?
Yeah. Well, I was born in Ventura County near the ocean. And so I've just always had this thing about water and being near water. So the Cottonwood Forest was just my favorite place to be. And I spent most of my free time there. And, I kind of heeded my mom's advice. And when I would go in the water, I would just go in up to kind of my calves or never past my knees, because I knew if I went in the very fast downstream current, I could see what she was talking about, because I'd once seen a full-grown cow moose swim across the river and not even get to the other side before she was swept around the bend. So I knew that like a 9-year-old girl like me didn't stand a chance against that kind of power.
Right.
Yeah. So I had a friend who I used to play with in the Cottonwood Forest named Justin, and we liked, we made up games and built forts and had water skippers and tried to catch frogs and things like that. And we had discovered this fallen cottonwood tree that was very slimy. It was just uncovered from the heavy winter load. And so it was wet and slimy. And we were making up a game of being gymnasts, working the beam.
Oh, boy.
And I inexplicably fell off of this cottonwood beam and fell off the cut bank of the river, the shore, into the river, like just boom, right into the downstream current. And there was a moment where I came up and it was, 40-degree water and my lungs were so stabbed. And I mean, when you've been in water like that, it just takes your breath away and you can't even catch your breath or, take a breath. And I remember looking at him and he reached out and grabbed my hand, and the river was so strong it pulled him into the river with me. So then here we are, 2 9-year-olds going downstream, no life jackets, no wetsuits. And of course, I'm thinking, we've fallen in, I'm going to die now. But what ended up happening was I heard a voice yell, swim, very loud. And I was like, oh yeah, swim. And
yeah, that's right.
We start swimming and we get to shore, and I said to Justin, like, I'm so glad that you yelled to swim. I was so cold, I forgot. And he said, I didn't yell swim. And I was like, well, who did? We're looking around and there's nobody there at all, not even any animals. And he's like, I don't know. I didn't hear anything. And, I deduced that it was the river that had yelled swim, and that the river had chosen to save our lives and to save me, and had felt sorry for me, or felt that it wanted to protect me as a mother would protect a child. And, and it wasn't the first time that I'd heard the river talk either,
and it wasn't the last time either.
And it wasn't the last. It was part of the relationship that I'd been building with the Snake River since I was a young girl, when we first moved to Jackson when I was 7. And so, in that moment of realizing, like, my mom was wrong, like I'd fallen in the river and not only did I not die, but the river had saved me, and that I knew more about the river than she did, and I realized in that moment, like, I was kind of on this separate journey and going to a place where she couldn't go.
Do you want to read that segment?
This wasn't the first time I'd heard the river talk. Since we'd moved to Wyoming from California 2 years earlier, I'd heard the snake's voice several times. It happened mostly when I was so focused on watching the river that I felt as if I'd blended into the surrounding shore. I knew it was strange to hear voices in the water, so I'd never mentioned anything to Justin or to anyone.
What was so important about that pivotal moment in your life in guiding us through the rest of the story? I
think I wanted it, actually, the story started originally with that second chapter, and the chapter baptism where I fall in the river was a prologue.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, initially, but then I had an epilogue in the end, and so we changed the prologue into chapter 1. But I wanted to start my story with that scene of my mom, and the ground beneath us kind of being pulled out.
Sure.
From us, and the wheels falling off the bus.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
that is, for me, when somebody asked me once, we were listening to that song, "The First Cut is the Deepest," and someone asked me once, like, what was your first heartbreak? And it was the disintegration of my family.
Yeah.
And so that's where the wheels fell off the bus, and the adventure really began for me, as far as trying to make my own way and forging a way where I could be safe and to navigate through these really difficult family dynamics.
Mm-hmm. And yet you go to live with your father in Ventura, who seems to provide this really glamorous life, but beneath the surface of that, there was a lot of turmoil. Can you bring us to that time in your life when you're trying to navigate what that means and why you're this victim to your father's anger?
There were a lot of things about that time period that I didn't understand until much later. And a lot of that comes in the last chapter of the book and the epilogue.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to give away too much about it.
I was going to say, so don't give it away.
Yeah, I won't. No spoilers. But, I had memories of domestic violence, but it happened with my mom and my dad when I was 3 and 4, when I was very young. So they had this sort of dreamlike quality to them, where they felt like they had happened in another time, or then perhaps I had made it up, or, it just had this kind of otherworldly quality to it, these memories. And my father at that point had never physically abused me. I just had memories of him abusing my mother. So I thought, he's never, when I visited him, there's never been any violence. I've never seen him be violent towards my stepmother. And, I had to make some decisions. Like, things had totally blown apart in my home life. My mother was leaving the man who raised me, who was my most present parent, who was the one doing the hard work day in and day out and very consistently, and who was very loving, and somebody who just thought the world of me, and I knew that he loved me unconditionally. And that person was no longer going to be in my family.
Yeah.
I would no longer be related to him. So I had to come up with a plan, and I was 14 years old. I have a 14-year-old, and she's very smart, but, coming up with where am I going to live, and how, who am I going to be, and how am I going to stay safe kind of plans. Thank God that's not something that she's faced with. So the thing that I had going for me was I had this dad and another family that I could go to. He had remarried, and they had a son. And so I had another brother. And, I just thought, well, I could just go live with him and fit in seamlessly over there. And that didn't go to plan.
Right. Yeah.
Largely because my father had a lifelong problem with rage. Mm-hmm. And that was revealed to me once I moved in with him.
There is a point in the end of the book that I actually did want to talk about, but I don't want to give it away. But I feel like it's so important because the relationship you have with your father is so volatile, and yet he shows to you that he loves you in such weird ways. And I wonder, being in a situation where the man who's supposed to protect you and love you beats you, and in situations where you were not at fault. I mean, it was literally, he had rage issues. But what I love so much about the book is you had the capacity to forgive him, and he had the capacity eventually to forgive himself, I think. And that's a theme in your book, this theme of forgiveness, this theme of love, despite the violence, despite the abuse. And I don't want to give too much away, so I'm trying to like paddle this very carefully.
Yeah, well, I want to make sure that readers understand that this theme of forgiveness, it's earned. My father earned my forgiveness.
He really did.
It wasn't something that I just was like, oh, well, water under the bridge. He worked very, very hard to transform. And in fact, that's a huge part of his character in real life and in the book, was this devotion and ability to work incredibly hard on himself, to better himself. I mean, he came from absolute poverty and squalor.
That's right.
He grew up in a very small town on the East Coast, and they didn't have running water in the house. My aunt recently told me that she didn't have a shower in a bath until she was 19 years old, and she moved out on her own.
Wow.
They did sponge baths, and they had an outhouse. So, it was very important for my father to make something of himself and to provide for his family, which he did magnificently. He very much struggled with learning deficits also, which was a huge part of, the rage. But all of this was unknown to us until later in life. So it was a big mystery for a long time, why he was behaving this way. But he always was just such a student of self-improvement and always, striving to be a better person. And so in those ways, he was able to transform himself, transcend his, disabilities that he had.
Sure.
And to truly change and being willing to talk about them openly, being willing to talk about the problems in the family openly, to work together to overcome that was one of the biggest honors of my life, to be honest, to have that kind of a relationship with my father and to see both of us grow and change in such dramatic ways. But it took a lot of work.
Yeah. Well, and you really feel it too in the memoir, this very difficult childhood, and yet in the end you feel like this sense of beauty, this relationship that I think it takes a lot of courage and a lot of strength to have the forgiveness and have those conversations and to be able to love someone despite their past. And, the past he created for you, and I think it's interesting how both of your parents were incredibly problematic, abusive in their own ways, or even neglectful might be a better word. And yet I can see how who you are as a person is such a result of those hardships. And, we take the best of what those hardships teach us, and that's who we become, right?
Yeah. And it was very important to me to also show that my parents are in context, right? That they are people inside of a story of multi-generational abuse that they, had grown up in and lived in. And it's very difficult when you grow up in abuse to override those instincts. I loved listening to the podcast that you did with Bonnie Comfort, and she talked about the emotional inheritance.
Yeah.
Right. And so you grow up like it's in your DNA.
Totally.
This way of reacting and responding emotionally. And so to overcome those instincts it takes tremendous effort and will and hard work. And both of my parents did extraordinary when it came to overriding the childhoods that they came from. I mean, they did most of the heavy lifting in our family to change that cycle. And, I was sort of set up to be, they ran the heck out of their leg of the race, right? And then when they handed me the baton, I didn't have, I was at a huge advantage. I didn't have far to go.
Wow. That makes me teary-eyed. That's really beautifully said. Wow.
Yeah. And, I think it's easy people are so quick to judge and criticize and look at, well, they didn't do this and they didn't provide that. But the things that they did provide was an extraordinary skill set of survival.
Yeah.
Which served me very well as an international guide, as I show in the book. And I couldn't have had that skill set and have the kind of strength that I have without the upbringing that I had.
Yeah, exactly. And the moment that is so, beautiful is you finally stand up to your dad, you tell him you're staying in Wyoming, and he surprises you. He responds with tenderness instead of rage. And I think that's a pivotal moment in the book where you realize that maybe there's something more happening here, right?
Yeah. And at that time I was 17 years old.
Yeah.
And
You're a baby.
I was a baby and making very grown-up decisions, with an undeveloped frontal lobe, that had dire consequences. But it was sort of like, it was class 5, no matter which way I went. If I went to stay with my mom or I went to stay with my dad, it was going to be a class 5 section of the river. So it was like, pick your poison.
Right. And you compare, like in Zimbabwe, so the Snake River is your mother. And then you go to Zimbabwe and let me see if I say this correctly, Nyami. Did I say that right?
Nyami is the river god of the Zambezi River, which is the border between Zimbabwe and Zambia.
Right. And there's a point where the Nyami is sort of like the angry dad in this story. And there's this, I was going to ask this later, but maybe we can do it now. There's this really beautiful story about the Nyami and why he's so angry.
Yeah. So that, one of the things, we talked about earlier about my ability to communicate with rivers.
Yeah.
And the Snake River had always been this very mothering, gentle figure, protective. And so when I went to the Zambezi River in Zambia and was confronted with Nyami, the river god of the Zambezi, who is half crocodile and half serpent, and he comes from the Tonga tradition, the people who live along the Zambezi River on the Zambian side. Nyami, to me, from the beginning, was incredibly rageful and angry. I mean, he was a very malevolent presence. And I thought, I must have this wrong. Like maybe there's a cultural thing I'm missing in translation because, my experience with the snake had been the opposite of that. And so I had expected the Zambezi River to also, feel fondly towards me and take care of me. And,
right.
And it was like on day 1, the first 10 minutes of the trip, like actively trying to kill me. So having this understanding of Nyami's nature and kind of beginning that relationship with him, I mean, he reminded me of my actual father, and we would have this kind of banter all the time, kind of yelling at each other. And I ended up having this argument with Nyami, the banks of the Zambezi, and a Tonga friend of mine came along and he was like, "Are you arguing with Nyami?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he's like, "You can hear him?" And I said, "Yes." And, he asked, "Are you trained for this?" And I said, "No, not properly, but it's something that I've been able to do since I was a girl." In my culture, we don't talk about it because you're kafunta, which in Nyanja means crazy.
Yeah.
You're kafunta if you can talk to rivers. But yeah, it's something that I've been doing for a long time. And he talked about, that there are people in his tribe, the shaman in his tribe, who are trained for this properly and who can speak with Nyami. And I said, "Well, he's really angry." And my friend said, "Yes, he is, because the dam has been built on the lower Zambezi and it separates him from his wife, Katapo."
Yeah.
And so he's very, he's in a lot of grief, he's in a lot of pain and he's very angry. And this was the beginning of when I started to realize that maybe my father's anger had more to do with grief.
Mm-hmm.
Then, it was just him being an asshole, maybe there was something beneath the rage that I didn't know about. And so then I began to become curious about what that might be.
Right. Right. It's such a fascinating moment. I loved how much I learned about Zimbabwe, Zambians. There was a lot of heartbreaking racism that was happening there. So you dealt with a lot of like power structure and then the racism that you were privy to, but absolutely powerless to do anything about.
There were, it's interesting, like that section. And yes, thank you for bringing up the power struggle. I think that at the heart of The River's Daughter, what this book is about power and about shifting power within families, within communities, having grown up in a resort town with the haves and the have-nots, shifting that, looking at, examining and shifting that power structure. And then looking at, even going further into colonialism and racism, which is what I encountered when I went to Zambia, which had formerly been a British colony of Northern Rhodesia. And just the echoes and the residual racism that still existed, even though Zambia had overthrown white minority rule and had been free for, I think it was something like 28 years by the time I got there. There was still radically ingrained racism.
Yeah. And
encountering that didn't feel that different to me than, the power structures that I'd found myself in my family, in the river community, and within the town that I grew up. And I really struggled in, I think, the thing that I really wanted to look at in writing this book was also showing, like, how do we shift the power? And I come in like super hot. I'm 20 years old and I see racism and I'm just immediately like, I confront it head on and, put myself and others in very dangerous situations, just with radical righteous indignation. And I'm going to, and white saviorism, and I'm going to come in and I'm going to change this. And you see that not work out very well for me. I'm thinking particularly of this scene at the pool party where, I confront the white Africans that I was with at the time on the racism and was really put in harm's way as a result. And then, the next time I encounter it, I go in like a capitalist and threaten, people by, I'm going to do a smear campaign against your business and, I'm going to starve you into nothing. And, I get some effect that way, but, that's not really changing the system. And then, some things happen to a friend of mine and I'm able to just kind of like one-on-one with people, have conversations that starts to shift the dynamic. Yeah. And that's really, to me, how we do shift it. It's a heartfelt conversation, in the same way that my father and I were able to shift this power dynamic that had happened in our family through these heartfelt conversations and being open to listening and considering things from another point of view. I think that's the key.
Wow. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's a great lesson for all of us. It's a good transition, that pool scene. If we go back a little bit, and we probably should, where you meet Steve. You're living with your mom. You don't feel safe in that environment either. And while she's not physically abusing you, she's more neglectful. And there's a scene where she's actually pushing you, toward an older man. I think he's 10 years older than you. And she's excited for you because he thinks you look hot. And to her, that's currency in her world, that you can do something with that. And you meet Steve and he helps kind of like bring you into another stage of your life where he gives you power. He makes you feel safe. Talk about that a little bit. And then the transition that I was thinking was, you get to Zambia and you realize that he can't make you feel safe either. That maybe the only person who can make you feel safe is you.
Yeah, it's interesting. After I went to live with my father and that didn't work out. And so I leave and go back to live with my mother, who has undergone this radical personality change as the result of a personality disorder, which I didn't know at the time until much later. When I figured it out, it was very confusing to me why my mother just seemed to turn into somebody else overnight, which was what prompted the blowing up of the family when I was 14. So when I came back from California, my mother was somebody altogether different and involved with an environmental group that was very radical. And, there was a lot of partying and it wasn't safe for, a teenage girl to be in that environment. Thinking about putting my teenage daughters in that environment is
Terrifying, yeah.
Like keeps me up at night. But this was something that my mother, had brought us into and had fallen for hook, line, and sinker. And so this was our life too. And so it was this whole new dangerous world to navigate for me, just staying safe, just physically. There were just a lot of lecherous people around and, not a lot of protection because of, the drugs and the alcohol. People were pretty checked out in that way. And so I really needed protection at that point in my life, and ended up running into an old family friend who
also much older than you.
Yes, also much older than me, 10 years older than me, but somebody who it's interesting with Steve, the thing that brought us together was that we were both experiencing and overcoming radical trauma, like something traumatic had happened to him too, that was of the same caliber as what had happened to me. And so we immediately were trauma bonded and took on that role of being each other's defenders. And that served us very well for, a few years. And he had been a river guide and brought me into river guiding, which was like my calling. Finally I've discovered, my purpose and my calling. And we had a dream of going to the Zambezi River. That was something that we always had dreamed about. And then we had the opportunity and we did. And once we got there, our relationship really shifted, and it went from being more of a romantic, tender relationship to being more platonic, perfunctory, and more survival oriented, and remained that way for the remainder of our relationship.
It was really interesting to me because his shift was so night and day. I think maybe in the beginning, and maybe you mentioned this with the trauma bonding, he needed you emotionally. But once you got to Zambia, his ego was all that drove him, and he needed you to just perform. Yeah,
and that was a role that I pretty comfortable. When kids who grow up in families like mine, your job is to be who people want you to be. This is like the root of codependence, right? I'm going to be your version of me. Yeah. Like, you read Codependent No More by Melody Beattie, which I've read 5 times because that is absolutely me, and that book speaks to me. I'm a mirror of, like, who do you need me to be? Like, it's all in the interest of survival. I need to cut off parts of myself to make this relationship work. I'm happy to do that. Like, I can be whoever you want me to, and really be that chameleon. And I had tons of experience doing it, going between my parents,
right.
who are polar opposites. I mean, my mother's this environmentalist hippie, and my dad's, Porsche driving realtor developer, so I'm growing up in these absolute polar opposites. So I had already a lot of experience having different selves. I mean, my identity was so fractured already when I met Steve. It was easy enough for me to adopt another role, and hide the rest of them. That's fine. But there is a real emotional cost when you do that to yourself. When you go underground with parts of yourself, you pay a price down the road. And for me, it came in the form of alcoholism, addiction, and codependence. I was snorting Steve just the same as I was any other drug.
Right, Yeah. But you did manage to keep hold of yourself, and I think to hold on to that piece of you that was so important. And I think you did that because of your relationship with the water and with nature.
Absolutely. That was my foundation. And that was the thing that I could always rely on. Mm-hmm. And that was, that inner sanctum and the thing that, God consciousness and, that universal truth that the river always had my back and I could always rely on it.
I heard you say once in an interview, in nature, you lose the burden of being human. I don't know if you remember saying that.
Yes.
But it really resonated with me because, there's so much that we have to maintain and adhere to and follow. And yet in nature, if we can let go of that, we find this person that we didn't maybe know existed. And it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I mean, biologically, we're meant to be part of nature, not separate from it, and it's our culture that tells us that we're separate from it, culture and religion, that we're separate, that we're better, that we're superior to nature, that it's here to serve us, in whatever capacity we deem appropriate, rather than fitting ourselves into the world we live in. We go out and we subjugate the world around us, and that's not going so well for us.
It's not working out, is it? Yeah.
No, it's not working out the way we thought it would. So, part of my hope in writing this book was to show, and I get this question a lot about, wow, you can hear voices in the water. Tell me more about that. And when people ask that, what I think they're really asking is, how can I hear voices? How can I communicate with nature in that way and have that kind of a relationship? And so I wanted to show how can people, begin to reimagine their relationship and their place in the natural world.
Yeah. I have a similar experience. There's a place in the book that really sticks with me, and I think about it all the time, and I want to talk about it here in just a minute, in the Kern River, and I know you know which scene I'm talking about. But so I'm a rock climber, and when I discovered climbing, I had this moment that was very similar. It was like a paradigm shift where all of a sudden, not literally, there weren't words. Nature wasn't speaking to me with words, but nature spoke to me. It's like the world completely stopped. And there was this silence and this moment that felt like it lasted a lifetime, where I saw everything completely different. And I realized how important it was, this connection to being above the ground floor, up on a rock, looking at the birds, communing with the trees, that it shifted everything. And I realized that all these things we're fighting for. And there's this other scene in the beginning of your book that resonated with me so deeply. The little girl who wants to drive around in daddy's Jag and wear Guess jeans. And, my heart went out to that little girl so much, because that's what we're all doing. We're trying to become what we see in Teen Magazine and Vogue Magazine and now on social media, when yet if we can let those things go and have that moment with nature, we can change our lives. I want you to take us to the moment where you jump into the river, into the rapids, knowing that that's probably going to kill you, but you do it anyway.
Yeah, so there's a scene where I go rafting for the first time with Steve on the Kern River, and I'm 18 years old. And we get to camp on the lower Kern River. There's, it's a 2-day trip, and we get to camp, and there's a rapid, a smaller class 2 rapid in front of the camp. And so as an activity and for fun, clients are encouraged to jump into the river, swim through this class 2 rapid, and then swim to shore. And as an 18-year-old girl, who's been told her whole life by her mother, if you fall in the river, you're going to die. That's super hardwired. Even though I'm I kind of abandoned that idea as a young girl, it's still in my mind. And I had the idea that it was maybe a very disrespectful thing to do. It's one thing if you fall into the river and on accident, haplessly, and the river saves you, it's like a one-time thing. But it's another to on purpose jump into the river. Right. That seems super disrespectful. And so I was very concerned with, doing this and being perceived by the Kern River, who I didn't know very well. I just met, it was day one, as being having this sort of hubris or something and being disrespectful in that way. But I, went along with the group, and, we were told we're going to have our life jackets on. They showed us how to swim through. They were going to have throw bags at the bottom set up for safety. So this was, a guide-led, safe activity, and it would prepare us for the next day, which was class 4 rapids. Should we swim, we would kind of know what to do and be prepared. And so
wow, yeah,
I was okay, I guess I should do that to be prepared if it's, we're going to be potentially swimming class 4. And so I remember leaping off of the shore and thinking like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life. And falling into the river, getting my feet up so they don't drag on the bottom and I don't get entrapped on any rocks on the bottom of the river, and breathing through the troughs as I go, crest through the waves, and then breathing the troughs. And when I got to the bottom of the wave train, I got on my stomach and I swam like a possessed water skipper into the eddy current, which is, the calm current on the side of the river that's not going downstream. And when I got into the eddy, I heard someone laughing and I realized it was me. Like I was having the best time of my life. And it was kind of in that moment when I decided like, I'm going to be a river guide. Like, this is amazing. This is the most fun a person could possibly have.
And you did it over and over.
Yeah, I did it over and over into the night. Yeah, until, it was dark and it was time, like you just couldn't do it anymore. It was dinner, time to come in. And I still do that every time I'm on the current and I'm at that spot. I swim the heck out of that rapid over and over.
And you've taken your brothers, you've taken your
I've taken
family.
my kids. My kids have swam that rapid, like my husband, everybody swam that rapid.
Well, I'm going to take your word for it that it's safe. But when I was reading that, I was like, oh my God, that sounds like the scariest thing. And for me, like, I'm a big fan of like very stable rocks. Granite is like my favorite. Water terrifies me because you can't control it. And yet that's sort of the point of your book, isn't it?
Right. You can't control it, but you can understand it.
Right.
And that's what learning how to read water, you learn how water behaves. And so you can recognize features from above. Like, that's what you learn in guide school is how to read water. And you can see from above that when there's a curve on the horizon line, that's a rock, and the water is piling up around the rock, and either it's flowing over the rock and becoming a recirculating hydraulic, or it's pooling around it, and then behind it will be a calm eddy. So you start to learn the features and being able to recognize them. So it's not foreign to you anymore.
Which is, of course, makes total sense, but still sounds incredibly terrifying. But part of me kind of wants to go there and do it, even though I'm like very much afraid of water and not a great swimmer either. I mean,
you'd be so surprised how many people come rafting to get over their fear of water, and they're, to kind of face their fear of and they can't swim and they're afraid of water. And I'm like, maybe start at a pool, but that's
very good advice. Very good advice.
You've got a
it's not
life
working
jacket.
Against you.
We've got an ocean right here.
I know.
Right. Maybe start smaller. You don't need to, jump into class 4 and you can't swim. And you're going to get over your fear of water, But
yeah, that's what I do. I jump in the deep end. I'm like, okay,
yes,
I'm afraid of heights. I'm just going to do this. I'm still afraid of heights, but I conquered it. I still climb. It's, to me, it's the most, and I wonder if you have this experience that I have with climbing. Like when I first get out to the, whatever I'm climbing, I want to be the first person to lead so that I can get through that fear. Because if I watch someone else lead, I think of all the things that can go wrong and how terrifying it is, and I psych myself out. So I have to like literally jump in, do it. And then as I'm climbing, I'm telling myself, this is the dumbest, most asinine thing I've ever done. I'm never doing this again. And then I get to the top and I look around and I think, this is what life is all about. It's so beautiful and so remarkable. And of course I'm going to do it again.
Well, I think what's really wonderful and grounding about those sorts of things and experiences is that, it requires this hyper focus that brings you into a meditative state.
Yep.
Which most people don't experience because they're hyper focused on their phones and scrolling.
Or their stress.
Yeah, or their email or whatever it is. But to just take 10 minutes and with no distractions and sit in nature and listen to the birds and hyper focus on something in nature, that's when the burden of being human falls away, and you are absorbed into nature and you become nature.
Right.
You're not separate from it anymore. And so that's what, like rock climbing or running rivers, that's what it provided me was with, I'm there all day, hyper focused on current and water. And in that, it's a very meditative state where you kind of are at the center of the universe in a way. Like when I'm there, I feel like I'm just completely in the moment. It's this very Zen experience.
Yeah, nothing else exists.
Nothing else is happening.
Right. Which is so needed, for our monkey brains to have that state of calm. Do you still fear it though? Do you ever have this feeling of fear before you get going?
Well, I've come to realize that fear and adrenaline feel the same in our bodies. And so the things that I think I'm afraid of, I really kind of check with myself and like, no, this is just adrenaline coming into play a role. I mean, adrenaline's a tool to help you do superhuman things, that you're not capable on a normal day. And to, realize that it's a gift and, it's there to aid you. And so it has the same kind of feeling as excitement.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like really being able to discern that there's that nuance of like, it's not fear, it's adrenaline and excitement.
That's very, very smart. Before we got started, we were talking about your daughter and how she just started driving. We were talking about how scary it is that you like give this precious person who you've been trying to keep safe her whole life car keys and say, okay, now you're going to drive.
In Southern California, mind you.
Yeah, right. And you said, you talked about how you have used what you learned being a guide to kind of help her through that. And I would love for you to tell our listeners what you were telling us.
Yeah, so it's not, you don't just hand over the keys. There's a training period that goes with it, right? There's the learning period. So, it's interesting. My daughter was like, I thought you were going to be like so stressed out when we'd be driving and I'd be, helping her navigate or suggesting things or just in the car with her as she was practicing. She was so, surprised that she thought I was going to be like super stressed out and like nervous. And I was very calm. And she's like, I was, like, why are you so calm? And I was like, well, I've trained legions of river guides, in class 3 and 4 whitewater and been in the boat many times and we're going into a rapid and they've got the wrong angle and they're going in the wrong way. And I know we're going to flip and that's just part of the journey. And so it has that exact same vibe, it was the same exact feeling being in the car with her in that way. So I just kind of switched into guide school instructor mode.
and it served you well.
Yeah. And, and now I know my kid's a good driver because I trained her, nice. and she's very perceptive and, pays attention and feels, I think the main thing is just feels confident. She has a lot of confidence on the road, which is what you need as a guide also.
Absolutely. Are you still a guide?
I do still do trips. I do what's called celebrity guiding at this point, where I come in for a special event, or I guide trips with a friend of mine. We do these women's adventure wellness retreats. And so I guide rafts. They're on rivers. We do one in Costa Rica. We have one coming up in February on the Bakwari River, which is one of my favorites. And we do journaling and she does Ayurveda. And we're at this river lodge. It's super beautiful in the heart of the Costa Rican rainforest. It's one of the most biodiverse areas in Costa Rica. And then we do zip lining and different things too. But yeah, I put together kind of special trips like that.
That sounds amazing. How do we sign up for that?
There's stuff on my website. There's a tab called retreats on my website and you can get information there and reach out to me and I can send you more information and see if that's, going to be a good fit for whoever wants to come.
Right. What's really crazy is just yesterday, my best friend and I were talking about what going on vacations. And we were talking about tour buses, how when she goes to a city, she gets on a tour bus and goes around to see what's in the town. And I was just like, God, that sounds absolutely awful. It was like my least favorite thing to do is be a tourist, right? But it's smart because you get to see everything. Right. And then I was like, well, maybe there's something to that. And then she says to me, well, maybe we should start thinking differently and maybe like, I hear there's trips you can go on to Costa Rica where they have yoga and like they guide you through like adventure yoga tours. And I was like, really?
I actually run one of those. So yes, come talk to me.
So apparently I'm supposed to be there. So we'll talk more about that. Are you working on anything right now? I know you have had a really busy couple of months touring and meeting with people and doing events. Are you finding time to write? And do you have another book in mind?
Yes. Yay. I have several other books in mind. And in fact, when I was working on The River's Daughter, I, cast a very wide net and because I have a lot of I was a professional river guide for 17 years, working full year round in the Southern Hemisphere and the Northern Hemisphere. So I have a lot of experiences on a lot of rivers that I want to talk about. And, if I'd put it all in one book, it was going to be like a 900-page book. So I realized that I needed to break it up. And so I've currently got it broken into 3 sections. And The River's Daughter is the first in the trilogy. And then there's 2 more.
Oh, wow. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, of the river guiding.
Nice.
Yeah, so like the good news is that I've got 2 more books that are outlined and partially written, because in wandering around in the wilderness of writing the first book, I kind of just wrote all these different things, and then it started to become clear to me how they went together. So there's parts of the next 2, and now that I'm back from my tour, which was amazing. It was so great to connect with so many people from my past that showed up at different events, and reminded me of things like there were people that I worked with in Chile, and that's a big part of the second book. And so, they brought up stories and we reminisced, and Costa Rica, just so many different parts to the journey. So it was fun to reconnect with those folks and to get excited about these next parts that I'm writing.
Very nice. What is your writing routine like?
Well, it mostly happens when my kids are at school.
Which luckily they're going back to school, so you'll have to write.
They're back to school soon, yes. And there's research, there's different components. There's research, there's writing, there's, working with writing groups to go through the material and edit it and refine it. So it's a process. My first book took me 22 years to write. And that was for a number of reasons. One, I had 2 small children that I was the primary caregiver for. My husband is a first responder, but he just retired. So he's taking the helm with the kids and giving, there'll be more time for me to focus on my writing. But also, just the emotional complexity of the story I was dealing with. Yeah. It took a while to work through that. And I don't, I don't know. I really hope it doesn't take 22 years for the next one. But I have a feeling that now that I've written a book and kind of know how to do it, it'll, and it's, I've got a map this time too with an outline and a lot of the scenes already kind of laid out and written.
And you teach writing as well.
I do teach writing. I'm on the faculty at the Jackson Hole Writers Conference, which is coming up in October 22nd to the 25th in my hometown. It's very fun. And I teach a class in the summers also in Jackson through Jackson Hole Writers, kind of nature writing. It takes place on the river. It's called The River as Guide. And so we raft on the Snake River and we work on different writing exercises along the way.
Nice. That sounds amazing. Yeah.
It is amazing. It's super fun.
Well, it looks like I'm going to have to see you in a couple different places. When did you decide that you needed to write this book? Was it sort of a slow burn? You were just journaling, or did you know, okay, I need to put this book out?
So I started journaling when I was in 5th grade.
Wow, that's cool.
And it was a way for me to just keep track of things that were happening. As part of my family system, there was a lot of gaslighting and denial. And so, I would say, remember when we did this? And I was like, no, we never did that. That never happened.
You're like,
so
actually.
I started writing, things down in my journal so I could keep track of what was happening in reality. And I always knew it was like like the river, it was a safe place for me to go with my feelings and to sort things out and to feel seen, you know. And then, as I started traveling and having these very amazing and radical experiences, I kept track of all of that.
Nice.
And I knew that I was very meticulous with my notes and the things I was writing about, about the culture and the language that I was learning, because I just always had this knowing that it was important and it was going to go somewhere. And it was all part of my purpose and what I had to offer other people to, share my experience, and just kind of to help others who might be in similar situations with how to overcome these difficult cycles and obstacles that people have growing up.
Wow, that's beautiful. You knew. You've been a writer and a teacher, really. I think a guide all along. That's really
Well, I'm
really
Aquarius.
cool.
That's what we do.
Well, I'm glad you do it.
Of course you're Aquarius.
Yes, I know. I was just thinking.
I'm
well,
a left-handed
perfect.
Aquarian, so I had no choice.
This was written in the waters, as
Yes.
they say. Well, it has been such a pleasure to talk to you and to hear about this journey, which is far from over. You have a lot to do, and I'm so excited to read the rest of your books. And I really encourage our listeners to get this book, The River's Daughter by Bridget Crocker. It's brilliant. It's beautiful. It makes sense to me that you had journals, because often I was like, how did she piece this all together so
There's so many
beautifully?
details.
It's awesome.
I have them all my journals in this very special storage unit, because I live in serious fire country. So I'm
so you
always
don't have them at the house.
No, the
Good
first
for
thing,
you.
I just have one or two that I could leave in a go bag with the ones I'm working on currently. And then, ones that I'm working on for the book, I'll have those, but I don't have them all here because that would be devastating to lose
if you
them.
lost them. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be devastating.
Yeah, that's
that's
currency
always
right
the
there.
first thing that I would, anyway, with, in Malibu, we have fires
All the time.
very, very frequently.
Yeah.
So that would be the thing. And I had them in a box. It was ready to go. And then I was like, this is a big box and it's really heavy. And so I just got a little storage unit. I keep it all there.
That is brilliant. Were you affected by the last fires?
My house did not burn down, but our community was,
Devastating.
all of us were very affected by what
Yeah.
happened. Just our community, the retail stores, our local independent bookseller, Malibu Village Books, is really struggling. So if you're at all inclined to buy The River's Daughter, I would just encourage you to go to bookshop.org and buy it there through Malibu Village Books to support my local bookstore that is just hanging on with everything they have, because the PCH was closed from Los Angeles to
totally.
Malibu for several months. I think it was 6 months.
Yeah.
And so there just wasn't enough local business to sustain a lot of the retailers, and many shops and restaurants. They all, went out of business
Yeah. Wow.
from the fires. And also we had mudslides and floods, like Duke's has been shut down. They survived the fire, but they were hit super hard by mudslides afterwards.
Right.
Yeah.
It's twofold. Absolutely devastating. Well, thank you for mentioning that. And we'll put a link to Malibu Village Shops too.
Thank you.
And
if you're all into audio, I read the audio version. And if you have a subscription to Spotify, you can get The River's Daughter free with your subscription as an audiobook.
Oh, wow.
Which is kind of fun. Yeah. My publisher, Spiegel and Grau, has a relationship with Spotify.
Nice.
And that's one of the benefits. So if you are an audio person who likes to listen, it was really fun to record that and to tell my own story.
I'm glad you read it yourself, because reading the book is one experience, but I'm going to listen to it because I'll be curious to hear how I experience it in a different way through your voice. That'll be awesome. That's
Well,
great.
it was interesting because, they had to audition for it.
Oh,
and
of course you did.
My agent
Are you
fought
good
hard,
enough?
actually, to get a clause in my contract saying that I could audition for it. That was the first hurdle.
Wow.
And then I auditioned for it, and I remember feeling all this pressure, like I have to nail this. It is unacceptable to me to have someone else tell my story.
Right.
So I was very motivated to land that gig.
Nice. I would love to have a whole nother conversation with you about that process, about publishing, and just you as a writer, because you're also a travel writer, an outdoor writer, and there's so much you do that I find really wonderful. So maybe we'll have you back sometime.
Well, I'm happy to come back anytime. It's been a delight to speak with you and Chad, and I just love, your podcast and what you guys are doing in service to writers. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Bridget Crocker, thank you for joining us on The Premise. You can see photos and learn more about Bridget Crocker on her website, bridgetcrocker.com. You can also follow her on Facebook at Bridget Crocker Author, on Instagram at Bridget Crocker, and great news, she is starting a Substack. So find her on Substack, where you can read what's happening with her journey, her upcoming books, and everything Bridget Crocker. Again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
This has been another episode of The Premise. You can visit us online at thepremisepod.com and subscribe and rate or review The Premise wherever you get your podcasts. Those reviews really help us get the word out, and it helps increase our subscriber base. You can follow me, Jeniffer Thompson, on Instagram at Jennifer Grace, or follow me on Facebook at Jeniffer Thompson Consulting. Until next week, thanks for listening. Goodbye.
Goodbye.